mother dog and her puppies, thrown from a moving car, but something inexplicable happens. The December wind howled through the bare branches of the trees lining Route 27 in rural Massachusetts, carrying with it the first flakes of what the Weather Service predicted would be a significant snowstorm. Tom Henderson pulled his weathered Ford pickup closer to the yellow line, squinting through the swirling snow at the dark road ahead. At 63, his night vision wasn't what it used to be, but he had no choice but to make this late-night drive. The pharmacy in town had finally called to say his prescription was ready, and with the storm coming, he couldn't wait until morning. 20 years as a high school English teacher, followed by early retirement after Sarah's death, had left Tom with plenty of time to reflect on life's cruel twists. The empty farmhouse he inherited from his parents felt more like a Milam than a home these days, filled with echoes of happier times and the ghosts of what could have been. He and Sarah had always talked about filling it with children. But cancer had other plans, stealing her away just 3 years into their marriage. The headlights of an approaching car caught his attention, and Tom eased his truck further to the right as the vehicle, a dark sedan, passed him. Something about its movement seemed off. The car was weaving slightly, and just as it drew, even with his truck, Tom saw something large and dark being thrust out of the passenger window. His foot instinctively moved to the brake as he watched in horror as not one but several shapes were thrown onto the road behind the speeding car. The sedan's tail lights disappeared around a bend, leaving Tom alone with what he had just witnessed. "Dear God," he whispered. Bringing his truck to a complete stop, his hands trembled as he reached for the hazard light switch. Years of teaching had trained him to document license plates of suspicious vehicles, and even through the snow he had managed to catch the first 3 digits KRW, grabbing his flashlight from the glove compartment. Tom stepped out into the bitter cold. The wind immediately bit through his will coat, but he barely noticed the beam of his flashlight swept across the asphalt, and his heart nearly stopped when it illuminated a large, golden fur dog lying motionless on the road. As he approached, the dog's head lifted weakly, and he saw it was a female, her eyes full of pain, and fear met his, and something in Tom's chest cracked open. Then he heard it, tiny whimpers coming from nearby. His flashlight beam revealed the full horror of the situation. 4 small puppies, no more than a few weeks old, scattered across the road. "Oh, you poor things," Tom breathed, his voice catching. He approached the mother dog, slowly speaking in soft, soothing tones. "It's okay, girl, I'm here to help. I'm not going to hurt you." The mother dog watched him wearily, but didn't growl or try to move away. As he got closer, Tom could see she was injured. There was blood on her front leg, and she was holding it at an awkward angle despite her own pain. Her eyes kept darting to her puppies, and she whined anxiously. Tom removed his coat, shivering as the cold cut through his sweater. "Let's get your babies first," he told her, amazed at how she seemed to understand, watching intently as he gathered each puppy. They were golden, like their mother, with little spots of brown, some kind of retriever mix. He guessed miraculously, while they were scared and shivering. None of the puppies appeared to be seriously injured. He created a nest with his coat in the truck's passenger footwell, carefully placing each puppy inside the mother dog's eyes. Never left her babies. And when Tom returned to her, she made a valiant attempt to stand easy there, girl. He soothed, noting how she favored her right front leg. "Let me help you." He was surprised when she allowed him to slip his arms beneath her, lifting her carefully. She was heavy, at least 70 pounds, but Tom's adrenaline gave him the strength he needed to carry her to the truck. Getting her into the cab was a challenge, but somehow he managed settling her on the passenger seat where she could see her puppies below. As Tom closed the door and hurried around to the driver's side, his mind was already racing. The nearest emergency vet was in Springfield, almost an hour away. His prescription would have to wait. Let's get you all somewhere safe, he said, cranking up the heat. The mother dog's eyes met his again, and this time there was something different in them. Not just fear and pain, but a glimmer of trust as Tom pulled back onto the road. The snow was falling harder. He found himself talking, filling the silence with gentle words. You know, girl, you're pretty lucky I don't usually drive this road at night. Any more used to take it all the time when I was teaching. But that was years ago. He glanced at her, noting how she kept her injured leg carefully still while staying alert to every movement from her puppies. We'll get you fixed up, don't you worry. The mother dog's golden fur was matted and dirty, suggesting she hadn't been well cared for even before this terrible night. No collar, he noticed, though that didn't necessarily mean anything. She could have lost it, or someone could have removed it before Tom's hands tightened on the steering wheel as anger surged through him. Who could do something so cruel? The puppies were whimpering less now, warmed by Tom's coat and each other's presence. One of them, slightly larger than the others, with a distinctive white patch on its chest, poked its head up over the edge of the footwell, earning a soft grunt from its mother. That one's going to be trouble, Tom said with a small smile. The first he managed since witnessing the terrible act. The mother dog made a sound that seemed almost like agreement. The drive to Springfield took longer than usual due to the deteriorating weather, but Tom finally pulled into the parking lot of the emergency veterinary hospital. Shortly after midnight, the building's bright light spilled out onto the snow-covered pavement, and Tom could see several staff members moving around inside. "We're here," he told his passengers. "Let's get you the help you need." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. The emergency veterinary team sprang into action as soon as Tom carried the mother dog through the doors, her puppies following in his coat, now carried by a technician. Dr. Maria Ramirez, the overnight veterinarian, quickly assessed the situation. "She has a fractured radius," Dr. Ramirez explained after the initial examination, "and x-rays. She'll need surgery to repair it properly. The puppies are remarkably unharmed, scared, and a bit dehydrated, but no serious injuries. They're about 5 weeks old, just starting to wean. Someone must have been caring for them at some point." But she trailed off, her expression darkening. Tom sat heavily in one of the waiting room chairs, the events of the night catching up with him. Will she be okay? Dr. Amirs nodded. With surgery and proper care, she should make a full recovery. She's actually in pretty good condition otherwise, despite some signs of neglect. We'll need to do the surgery soon. Though, are you able to cover the costs? If not, we can look into some rescue organizations. I'll pay. Tom interrupted. The thought of these dogs being separated or sent to a shelter was unthinkable. Whatever it costs, just help her. The vet smiled. "We'll need to give her a name for our records. Any ideas?" Tom thought about the mother dog's gentle eyes, her quiet strength. "Peggy," he said. After a moment, "Her name is Peggy," while Peggy was in surgery. Tom sat with the puppies in a small examination room. The tech had shown him how to bottle feed them a special formula, since they wouldn't have access to their mother for several hours. As he cradled each puppy, feeding them one by one, he found himself studying their distinct personalities. The one with the white patch on its chest, a male, was indeed the most adventurous, squirming and exploring whenever he got the chance. Tom named him Scout. The smallest puppy, a female with a perfect brown circle around her left eye, he called Daisy. Another male with golden fur, so light it was almost white, became Ghost. And the last female, who had a calm, watchful nature like her mother, he named Sage. As the night wore on, Tom called his neighbor Martha Wilson and asked her to check on his house and pick up his prescription. When the pharmacy opened, Martha, a retired nurse who had known Tom since he moved to town with Sarah, listened to his story with growing concern. "You're doing a wonderful thing, Tom," she said. "Those poor creatures. "Do you need anything else? I can bring some supplies over when you get them home." Tom hadn't really thought that far ahead, but he realized he had already made the decision. These dogs weren't going anywhere else. Dr. Ramirez came to update him. Around 4 a.m., "The surgery went well," she said. "We've placed a plate and screws to stabilize the fracture. Peggy's a fighter. She came through beautifully. We'll need to keep her here for at least 24 hours for observation. But you can take the puppies home if you'd like. They'll need feeding every few hours." Tom shook his head. "I'll stay. They need to be near their mother, and she needs to know they're safe." He looked down at the sleeping puppies now curled together in a warm blanket provided by the hospital. "Could I see her in the recovery area?" Peggy was just waking from the anesthesia. Her right front leg was bandaged and splinted, but her eyes were alert as Tom approached. She lifted her head when she saw him, and her tail thumped weakly against the padding of her cage. "Hey, beautiful girl," Tom said softly, crouching down to her level. "Your baby are fine, they're all safe." He reached through the cage door to gently stroke her head, and Peggy leaned into his touch. "You're stuck with me now. I'm afraid all of you over the next several weeks." Tom's life transformed completely. The farmhouse, which had been so quiet for so long, filled with the sounds of life. Peggy and her puppies took over the mudroom, which Tom converted into a comfortable recovery space with help from Martha and her husband Bill. The local hardware store donated material for puppy gates, and the owner's wife Phelan brought over old blankets and towels. Words spread through the small town about what had happened, and soon Tom found himself with more support than he could have imagined. His former students, many now adults with children of their own, stopped by with donations of dog food, toys and supplies. The local police took his report about the car seriously, though. Without a full license plate number, there wasn't much they could do. Peggy's recovery was slow but steady. She proved to be an exceptionally gentle and patient dog, tolerating the veterinary visits and physical therapy with quiet dignity. Her puppies grew quickly, their personalities becoming more distinct. Each day, Scout lived up to his name, always the first to investigate new things and figure out how to escape the puppy pen. Daisy became the cuddle expert, while Ghost developed a habit of appearing silently beside people, earning chuckles from visitors. Sage remained the thoughtful one, watching and learning before acting. Tom found himself settling into a new routine. His days, once empty and formless, now had structure and purpose. Morning medications and physical therapy exercises for Peggy, puppy feeding schedules, training sessions and playtime filled his hours. He started taking online courses about dog behavior and training, determined to give his new family the best care possible. Martha, who had been trying to get Tom to socialize more since Sarah's death, noticed the change in him. "You're smiling again," she said one afternoon, watching as Tom sat on the floor, surrounded by puppies, while Peggy dozed nearby, really smiling, not just being polite. Tom looked up, surprised. "I guess I am," he said, catching Scout as the puppy attempted to make another break for freedom. They make it impossible not to, as winter melted into spring. Peggy's leg healed completely, though she retained a slight limp that Dr. Ramirez said might be permanent. The puppies grew into gangly adolescents, their training progressing well, thanks to their mother's good example and Tom's dedicated efforts. The farmhouse's fenced backyard became their playground, and Tom found himself spending more time outdoors than he had in years, watching them romp and play one warm April morning. Tom sat on his back porch drinking coffee and watching Peggy supervise her offspring's latest game of chase. Martha had brought over the local newspaper, and as he flipped through it, an article caught his eye. The local animal shelter was struggling with overcrowding and needed volunteers. Tom stared at the article for a long time, thinking about that night on Route 27 about how close Peggy and her puppies had come to a terrible fate. He thought about the empty hours he used to spend in this house and how different his life was. Now that afternoon he drove to the shelter. The manager, Angela Torres, listened to his story with tears in her eyes. "We need more people like you," she said. "People who understand that every animal deserves a chance." Tom started volunteering 3 days a week, working with the shelter's more challenging cases, the scared ones, the ones who had known cruelty and needed to learn to trust again. He found that his experience with Peggy gave him a particular insight into these animals, and his patient, gentle approach began to yield results as summer approached. Tom made a decision. The farmhouse's 5 acres included an old barn that had stood empty for years, with help from Bill and some of his former students. He began converting it into a small rescue facility. The work was hard but satisfying, and Tom found himself looking forward to each day in a way he hadn't since Sarah was alive. Peggy seemed to understand what was happening. She would often accompany Tom to the barn, watching the renovation work with interest when he brought home the first rescue dog, a terrified shepherd mix who had been found abandoned like she had been. Peggy immediately took on the role of mentor, showing the newcomer around the property with gentle guidance. The puppies, now nearly full-grown, also seemed to inherit their mother's nurturing instinct. Scout's boundless energy made him perfect for playing with younger dogs, helping them come out of their shells. Daisy's sweet nature comforted the fearful ones, while Ghost's calm presence soothed the anxious sage, proved to be particularly good, with the elderly dogs lying quietly beside them in the sun, 1 year to the day after finding Peggy and her puppies. Tom stood in his backyard surrounded by dogs. The rescue facility, which he had named Second Chances, was now home to 12 dogs in various stages of rehabilitation. Martha had organized a small celebration, and the yard was filled with volunteers, adopters, and supporters from the community. Dr. Ramirez, who had become a close friend and adamant supporter of the rescue, raised her glass in a toast to Tom and Peggy. She said, "Who remind us that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes." Tom felt a familiar pressure against his leg and looked down to see Peggy leaning against him, her golden fur shining in the afternoon sun. She had grown plump and content over the past year, her eyes now filled with peace instead of fear. Her puppies, scattered around the yard in their various activities, had grown into beautiful, well-adjusted dogs, each with their own special way of helping the rescue's newcomers as he scratched behind Peggy's ears. Tom thought about that snowy night on Route 27. He thought about the cruelty that had brought Peggy into his life and how that one terrible act had set in motion a chain of events that transformed not just his life, but the lives of countless other animals. "You know what, girl?" he said softly to Peggy. "Sometimes the most inexplicable thing isn't the bad stuff that happens. It's how much good can come from it." Peggy looked up at him with those wise, gentle eyes that had first captured his heart on that cold December night, and Tom felt his throat tighten with emotion. In trying to save her and her puppies, he had found his own salvation. The empty farmhouse was now a home, again filled with the sound of paws on hardwood floors, the jingle of collars and the occasional bark. More importantly, it was filled with love, the kind of unconditional love that only animals seem capable of giving. The following week, Tom received a call from Angela at the shelter they had just taken in another mother dog with puppies rescued from a similar situation without hesitation. Tom said he would take them as he prepared the rescue facility for its new residents, Peggy at his side and her puppies helping in their own ways. Tom realized that something truly inexplicable had indeed happened that night, not just the rescue itself, but the ripple effect it had created. Every life saved, every dog rehabilitated, every Every successful adoption was part of a larger story that began with one act of cruelty answered by an act of kindness. The new mother dog arrived that evening, a black lab mix with 6 tiny puppies, as Tom helped settle them into the specially prepared whelping area. He noticed Peggy watching from the doorway. With careful movements she approached the nervous mother dog tail, wagging gently in greeting. The lab mix, initially tense, seemed to relax, as Peggy sat nearby, offering silent companionship looks like you've got another student. Tom told Peggy softly, "You're getting quite good at this teaching business." Word of second chances spread beyond their small town. Local news stations picked up the story, focusing not just on the rescue's work, but on the remarkable tale of its origins. Tom found himself reluctantly in the spotlight, but he used the attention to advocate for stricter animal cruelty laws and better support for rural animal rescue operations. The publicity had an unexpected benefit. One morning, Tom received a call from the state police. They had arrested a man in connection with several cases of animal abandonment, including one that matched the description of what happened to Peggy. The partial license plate number Tom had remembered proved crucial in linking the cases together when Tom shared the news with Martha. She shook her head in amazement. "It's like Sarah used to say, nothing happens without a reason." Tom paused. "At the mention of his late wife's name, he said slowly, "I think Sarah would have loved all this." He gestured around at the rescue facility, where volunteers were going about their daily tasks. "She always said this place was too big for just 2 people. She'd be proud of you." Martha said softly, "You've built something beautiful here," as if to emphasize the point. Scout chose that moment to race past them, leading a group of younger dogs in a game of chase. The once tiny puppy had grown into a handsome dog with boundless energy and an uncanny ability to make other dogs play. His siblings were equally engaged in their chosen roles. Daisy working with a shy newcomer Ghost, keeping watch over the senior dog area, and Sage helping a recently injured dog with gentle encouragement that evening. As Tom sat on his porch completing paperwork for the rescue's newest residents, he reflected on how much had changed in a single year. The farmhouse that had once felt too large and empty was now the heart of a thriving community. The pain of loss that had dominated his life for so long had been transformed into something purposeful and healing. Peggy lay at his feet, dozing in the warm evening air. Her slight limp remained a permanent reminder of that terrible night, but it didn't stop her from being the rescue's most valuable teacher. She seemed to instinctively know what each new arrival needed, whether it was space companionship or gentle guidance. The sound of car tires on gravel announced a visitor. Tom looked up to see Dr. Ramirez's vehicle pulling into the driveway. She had become a regular visitor, stopping by several times a week to check on the animals, and Tom suspected to enjoy the peaceful atmosphere of the rescue. "I brought someone I'd like you to meet," she called out as she parked. When she opened her car door, Tom saw a small elderly woman emerged from a passenger seat. "This is Mrs. Chun," Dr. Ramirez explained as they approached the porch. "She lost her husband recently and has been looking for a way to stay active and involved in the community." The woman smiled. "Shilly, I taught elementary school for 40 years. She said Dr. Ramirez thought perhaps I might be able to help here." Tom watched as Peggy rose from her spot and approached Mrs. Chun, tail wagging gently. The elderly woman's face lit up as she carefully extended her hand to the dog. Within moments, Peggy had guided her to one of the porch chairs, sitting beside her as if she'd known her for years. "I think," Tom said, smiling at the scene, "you've already been hired by our head of volunteer relations." As the sun set over the farmhouse, casting long shadows across the rescue facility's grounds, Tom could hear the sounds of his extended family settling in for the night, the soft padding of paws, the occasional bark or whine, the gentle murmur of volunteers finishing their evening tasks in the distance. Scout was making his final rounds with the younger dogs while his siblings guided their charges to their respective sleeping areas that night. As Tom prepared for bed, he found himself looking at a photograph of Sarah that sat on his bedside table. "You'd love them all," he said, softly. "Especially Peggy. She has your heart, always looking out for others." Peggy, who had followed him upstairs, placed her head on his knee, her eyes full of understanding. Her puppies, now grown, but still very much part of the family, had taken up their usual sleeping spots around the room. Scout by the window, Daisy at the foot of the bed, Ghost near the door, and Sage close to her mother as Tom drifted off to sleep, surrounded by the family he never expected to have. He thought about how life's darkest moments sometimes lead to the brightest futures. What had begun as a terrible act of cruelty had blossomed into something beautiful, a place of healing hope and second chances. Not just for the animals they rescued, but for the people who found their way there as well. In the years that followed, second chances would go on to save hundreds of dogs each with their own story of hardship and resilience. But for Tom, it would always come back to that snowy night on Route 27, when a simple act of kindness transformed not just 5 lives, but an entire community. And perhaps that was the most inexplicable thing of all, how love, even in the face of cruelty, has the power to heal, transform and create ripples of hope that extend far beyond our understanding.